Alright folks, today I'm here to take you through the 7th volume of the Walking Dead comics, The Calm Before. If you haven't gotten the chance to check out my other videos covering the previous volumes up to this point, I'd highly recommend checking those out beforehand, as I will not be reintroducing the characters and plotlines we first encountered in those installments, which may lead to some confusion as the comic differs quite a bit from the show, but I will give a small recap on the last chapter before we get started to get you on track. Now, this volume sees the Governor arc continue as our survivors prepare for what they believe could be a violent attack from Woodbury following Michonne's mutilation of the Madman. A small mistake I wanted to clear up from the last video: I mentioned Otis had gone missing when the roamers invaded the prison, but in reality, Rick discovers his remains left behind near the fence when they arrive in a single panel. An unceremonious death for an unimportant character, but I figured it was important to correct. This version of the story is quite a bit different than the TV version, so I'm excited to hear what you guys think about it in the comments down below. And with that, if you end up enjoying this video, please consider hitting that like button and drop a sub to see more content like this. After getting released from Woodbury by Martinez, who claimed to disapprove of the governor's ways of leadership, Michonne would enact her revenge by brutally mutilating the madman in his own apartment. Despite knowing deep down she didn't finish the job, our survivors, along with Dr. Alice, would make their way back to the prison only to discover it overrun by the dead through human error. And although the threat would be taken care of relatively quickly with the help of Martinez, we would soon discover it was all a ruse, as the governor commanded him to break them out and report back the prison's location. But this information would never make it to Woodbury, as Rick runs him down with the RV before viciously strangling him to death in a field. It was clear retaliation was coming eventually. The forces of Woodbury clearly weren't going to stop until they found them, so if they were going to stay within this fortress, now was the time to prepare for the inevitable. Although our survivors have found themselves on the cusp of war with Woodbury, they still held the advantage of remaining hidden for the time being. So, making use of some of this downtime, Rick and Lori finally discuss preparations for the baby, who was set to arrive within a week, according to Alice, who has grown familiar with the prison's medical base since her arrival. There are very few calm moments when living in the apocalypse, so using this time wisely, Glenn and Maggie tie the knot with Herschel officiating the wedding following Glenn's proposal last chapter, as there's really no point in waiting nowadays. This is a rather strange time for our group, as some are celebrating the good left in this world, while others are struggling with the bad, such as Patricia following Otis's death, or Michonne, who finds comfort in Tyrese as she tries to forget all that has happened. But at the very least, our survivors had outlets such as basketball to bring them all closer after such a dark string of events. However, their time off from the horrors of the wasteland couldn't last forever, as in reality, their enemy was out there searching for them this very minute, and they needed to get to work prepping. So, taking inventory of the prison's armory, Dale comes to the conclusion they had nowhere near enough to defend themselves from an attack. If they wanted to survive this, they were going to need more weapons. And luckily, the governor himself had told them where to find some. Well, kind of. He told them Woodbury had acquired their heavy weaponry from an abandoned National Guard's outpost nearby, probably assuming it was okay to say, as they'd be roamer food soon enough. Even the scraps left behind could give them an advantage in this potential fight, so loading up the RV, the newlyweds along with Axel, Andrea, Michonne, and Tyrese head out in search of the base. In Rick's eyes, he should be going on this mission with them. His disability has made him feel useless, but the truth was he had already been out there more than enough lately, and as a result, Lori has been dwelling on the past more than usual. So without being able to hold it back any longer, she attempts to confess the baby is Shane's. But deep down, Rick already knew, and although he can't bear to hear her say the words, he accepts it for what it is. Lori, Carl, and this baby are all he has left in this world, and he won't let anyone take them away, especially a dead man who turned on him. Now, the others' time on the road searching for the National Guard station would be a rather uncomfortable one, as the RV was notorious for being a terrible place to sleep, which is one of my favorite running jokes in the series. But after discovering a sign pointing them in the right direction as a result of Axel taking a leak, our survivors arrive at the outpost where they immediately get their hands on all sorts of goods. Armored trucks, grenades, guns, and even a tank, but that wouldn't be very helpful without someone with the knowledge to operate it. The trip was basically worth it for the gas alone, and looking at how close it was in proximity to Woodbury, Andrea theorizes this was more than likely where they got their fuel. So looking to gain the upper hand over their enemy, our survivors would blow it to the sky on their way out. This explosion would surely grab Woodbury's attention, so wanting to take advantage of their time distracted, Glenn and Maggie implore the others to loot the Walmart nearby as they could use the supplies inside. But within minutes of browsing, the building would see a band of goons arrive on the outskirts with their weapons drawn. Who could have guessed parking a military truck outside a Walmart would give your position away? Although in Glenn's mind, there was nothing telling them they were the ones who escaped Woodbury. So coming out the front door with his hands up, he attempts to convince them they were simply survivors wandering around looting from place to place. However, one of the goons recognizes him from his time crying in the cell, and without hesitation, takes a shot right at his chest, triggering a firefight that ends with our survivors victorious as Michonne literally cuts down half the competition. Luckily, Glenn's riot armor had stopped the bullet from entering, and although Maggie was filled with relief, this incident showed just how easy it was to make the wrong move in the wasteland. Now, it wouldn't exactly be a relaxing day back at the prison either, as Lori steps out of the compound in pain while announcing the baby is coming. What followed was a chaotic few minutes as all rushed to prepare Alice for everything she'd need, including Billy, who steps up and volunteers to get the generators running as he encounters Dale for help along the way. However, after discovering the gas canisters empty inside, the two risk going out to the parking lot to collect more as the sun begins to set. And as expected, within minutes, the dead would overwhelm them as some crawl out from beneath the vehicles, resulting in Dale suffering a bite on the ankle in a scene that eerily mirrors Alan's death 3 volumes ago. And despite having shown signs of stepping up to the plate when the time calls for it, Billy regretfully leaves Dale behind, believing him to be dead already. Although while fighting for his life back to the gate, Billy would encounter Andrea and the others who arrive just in time to see Dale crawling through the grass while refusing to die. Dale hasn't gotten many badass moments within the series so far, so this scene sticks out to me as one of his best. And what follows can only be described as a classic sinister The Walking Dead moment, as Lori's baby is born just as Dale is escorted into the medical wing. And having done this once before, Rick volunteers to be the one to amputate the leg barely minutes after his daughter's birth, as Alice begins work patching the stump. This is Kirkman's writing at its best. The beauty of something like childbirth contrasted with the horror of a walker bite and amputation is what I live for. All Rick can say afterwards is, this world. This fucking world. And I think that says everything you need in a situation like this. But capping off this fantastic scene, Lori simply stares at Rick, who looks to be in shock from the terror of what just happened, and says, I think we should name her Judith. Oh man, what an issue. Lori smiling and naming her child while her husband remains covered in another man's blood is the perfect amount of tragedy that makes this series stand out. But by the following day, Dale wakes up without a fever, which tells us definitively tainted limbs can be amputated to stop the spread of infection. Alan might have stood a chance at surviving if he hadn't lost so much blood. And although Andrea was furious at Dale for doing something so stupid, all she could do was hold him and cry as he tells her he loves her. Now, following the birth of Judith, we get a moment that really stands out to me for perfectly displaying the tragedy of growing up in this world, as after putting together a crib with his father, Carl gets to meet his sister for the first time, where he mentions how she was lucky as she would never remember the old world. Therefore, she won't be as scared as they are since this will all seem normal, which is just so dark, and it shows through the looks on both Rick and Lori's faces. Now, the timeline of the comic at times can seem rather confusing if you're not paying attention, as practically between pages we jump 2 weeks ahead where we see things have been rather calm following all that craziness. And although Dale is greatly struggling with the loss of his leg, Andrea would be there to help him navigate through this life-changing event. Despite his constant pessimism, he was happy to be alive. But that feeling of not being enough for her would begin to nag as he couldn't even participate in something as simple as target practice. In his mind, things have been too good, so naturally it would only be a matter of time before things went wrong. But we know this has a double meaning, as he not only fears the forces of Woodbury taking away everything they've built, but also fears the prospect of losing Andrea to his own age and incapabilities. As for everyone else, the extra ammunition gathered from the National Guard station has made it far easier to train everyone up. And for the first time, really since the prison was established, morale across the group was actually pretty high, all things considered. Even Carol finds herself in a great mood as she attempts to reconcile with Lori over lunch, which is a nice change of pace from what we've experienced with her since the fallout with Tyrese. Things are good, and from what they can tell, safe. So safe that Alice begins to turn her attention towards research as she requests Andrea's help bringing a roamer inside the fence. In her eyes, this is the time to start figuring out what it is they're dealing with. What are the roamers? Are they really dead? What can they learn from them? These are all valid questions, but Rick highly disagrees with her methods. He believes having a roamer on the inside was a risk for many reasons, but eventually meets her halfway by allowing it to be chained up between the fences. Now, as mentioned, Carol has seemingly returned to her old self as she continues to have personal talks with Lori without trying to join her in Rick's marriage. And although she clearly still holds a lot of fear on her shoulders as she asks if Lori would take care of Sophia for her if something were to ever happen, she leaves the conversation with a smile on her face as she visits Billy Green, who is still struggling with his own guilt over Dale before, jumping on, if you know what I mean. This could initially be interpreted as Carol taking control of her life, and although she does enjoy her conversations with Lori, she admits to finding her a bit patronizing ever since her attempt. Sometimes it's nice to just talk to someone who will listen, and who better than the roamer chained up inside who couldn't judge her if she wanted to. Clearly, Carol is in a much darker place than anyone could have imagined. Her turning a new leaf was simply a front that hid the pain within, and in one of The Walking Dead's most shocking moments, she feeds herself to the roamer while smiling as the group watches from the court in horror. And although Andrea would think quick to take the threat out, it was already far too late. Did she really believe that thing was gonna be her friend? No. She wanted to vent with no consequences before ending it all, while making sure nobody could save her this time, as confirmed by her wishes for the others to just let her die. And before this tragedy could even be processed by those watching, Carol would come back before nearly biting Tyrese as Andrea puts her down with a mercy kill. Yeah, if you didn't believe me before, Carol is a completely different character from what we see in the show. I can't help but notice how she goes out similar to how she believed Tyrese did back in Volume 3. A part of me will always wonder if the idea to take her life in that way was inspired by the events in the gym. But regardless, Carol will be buried in the prison yard next to Alan as the remaining survivors gather for a funeral. Her actions would leave everyone behind in complete shock, such as Billy, who lies confused following their moment before her death, and her daughter Sophia, who can only stare at the wall in silence. Not even Carl could get through to her at this time, but still, for everyone else, life goes on. So over the next 2 weeks, preparations and training would continue. And despite Andrea still feeling the effects of putting Carol down, Tyrese confesses he feels no sorrow for someone who would leave those they love behind, which really speaks to his state of mind considering what had previously happened with his daughter. However, the two weren't just training throughout this time, as they delivered Dale a peg leg they made together as a gift, which he greatly appreciates. Although his insecurities here do come to a head as he lets Andrea know he understands if she needs to find happiness within Tyrese. But of course, she just tells him to shut up because she loves him. Tyrese is just a close friend. This is the chapter where I feel their relationship really starts to show its warmth. And adding on to this sense of optimism in spite of the tragedies that have occurred, Glenn and Maggie agree to have a baby, believing this place to truly be something to call home, while Michonne and Tyrese seem to settle into a more monogamous relationship. The dead around the perimeter are still a problem, but in a way, for Rick, it's comforting knowing someone would have to fight through them first. Patricia is coming around to the group once again, and Carl is showing signs of being a normal kid for the first time in months. What else is there left to say? They've really built a life here. They can have casual fun in a day, find and maintain love, and recover from what once seemed like certain death. They've essentially conquered the challenges of living in the new world, and with Herschel's farm finally producing, food would no longer be an issue as well. There's only one thing that could really stop them now, and it's been over 2 months since they've heard anything from them. But unfortunately, almost like some sort of sick apocalyptic joke, today would be the day that threat would arrive in full force as the governor, in the flesh, while riding a tank, commands his army to kill them all. Alright folks, and that was The Walking Dead Volume 7, The Calm Before, which is a perfect title as the downtime in this chapter makes the governor's arrival at the end all the more terrifying. I find it funny that our survivors spend all this time preparing for an attack, just to be caught by surprise anyway, as they naively let their guards down. I know I mentioned in the last video I'd cover the governor's backstory in this installment, but then I remembered he barely even features in this chapter. So to me, it makes much more sense to include those elements in a video on Volume 8. Now, there are 2 huge changes in this installment compared to the show: the death of Carol and the survival of Lori. These events may have been the most shocking yet for you show-only fans, as, of course, Lori's death is considered one of the most gruesome in the early seasons, while Carol as a character is largely regarded as one of the biggest improvements over the comic, which is a sentiment I'd have to agree with. As shocking as it is, Carol doesn't really feature much between volumes 5 and 6, so I think her breakdown could have benefited from a little more setup. We knew she was in a fragile place following the events of Volume 4, but to feed herself to a walker seems like a bit of a drastic leap. The concept itself is extremely dark, but the execution could have used some work in my opinion. On the other hand, I find myself tossed up between which version of Lori I prefer, and spoilers for the next chapter of the comic. Each death is iconic for different reasons, and to be honest, I think both work really well for the respective stories told. So that is something I'll definitely be interested to hear your thoughts on going into Volume 8. The sickness arc is also a show-exclusive plotline, and although I think it's an absolutely fantastic addition, I don't think it would fit as well within the story told in the comics. The prison has like 12 people living there in this version, so if a flu were to break out, half our cast would either be dying or dead, which would take away from the tragedies to occur later. The next chapter is largely regarded as one of the deadliest in the comics history, so definitely be sure to watch out for that over the coming weeks. And please let me know your thoughts on this installment in the comments down below. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.